Shalom, brethren. Welcome all. So, Brother Siege is with us. This is TheCynicogue. He's coming from his cell phone to y'all, so that's why there's no picture for him, unless there is one on YouTube. I don't see one for him on StreamYard. Coming from his cell phone. Okay, mute that. Got it. So, go ahead and say hello to everyone, brother.
How's it going, everybody? Shalom.
Okay, so Brother CJ and I are going to get to some root of some political things and then discuss the spiritual implications of that. And we might discuss some stuff more towards the surface level from there. But we'll have to wait for him to pop back into the room because it seems that he was dropped somehow for some reason. So let me go ahead and cue up the video that we're going to base some of the context of this discussion on. So let me see. I'll duplicate this one. Actually, I'll just do it this way. So oh, this is the wrong channel. It's a mix of Christian stuff and some secular stuff that I watch. And CJ is back. I just got to put him into the room. And now he has a logo. Shalom, brother.
Shalom. Sorry about that. I changed the logo, and I don't know why that actually chopped me out, but I guess it did.
Okay, that is acceptable and fine. So this may actually be in a playlist of mine. That might just be the best way for me to pull it up. But at the moment, I'm already in a different process. So I'm going to okay, let me see. Library. Isn't that supposed to show me playlists? Oh, here's how I do things. Show more. And it might be in references or plays for the week. Not that I ever do plays for the week. I haven't started doing a thing like that. But now that I'm doing things more spur of the moment, which I'll take myself off camera since my nose is tickling. Yeah, that's one of the consequences of doing a lot of things and doing them spur of the moment. And CJ and I needed to address something, so we addressed that. But yeah. Oh, there's references. It was so right on the top that I was struggling to find it. Right under your nose. And then it's the word references, so my subconscious kind of thought it meant like some kind of category, I guess. But here we are. Okay, it's not here. Oh, the email to you, CJ. I sent it to you. So I'm still digging this up. It's coming up. Don't worry.
Okay.
All that time with CJ, I could have taken care of this during that time. But I did just find it. Let me see. I guess if I just click on it and click open, it'll make it a website.
When Benjamin Franklin exited the Constitutional Convention, he was asked by a woman, "Sir."
Okay, that was in the email. That's not the one I want to use. So I'm going to share it and we'll watch it. So here we go. Thank you for your patience. Sorry for complete lack of professionalism here. But this video is very well worth it. So we'll pause it maybe at a couple points and we'll try not to say too much. but for purposes. So here it goes.
When Benjamin Franklin exited the Constitutional Convention, he was asked by a woman, "Sir, what have you given us?"
Okay, there we go.
When Benjamin Franklin exited the Constitutional Convention, he was asked by a woman, "Sir, what have you given us?" His immediate response was, "A republic, ma'am, if you can keep it." Yet most Americans today have been persuaded that our nation's governmental system is a democracy and not a republic. The difference between these two is essential in understanding Americanism and the American system.
Okay, so I don't know if you want to preempt what we're about to watch at all, or how you feel about that, given the topic there. But you're on mute, brother.
Only just to say that more specifically, I don't know if he's going to, say this yet, but more specifically, it's not that America is not a democracy. What it is that republic is a specific kind of democracy. And the way that I would kind of describe it is almost like, if you have a general idea like freedom, right? All right, well, freedom's great, but how exactly do you apply that in the real world? What does that mean, right? Because for some people, that's libertarianism, and for some, it's going to be anarchy, and for some, it's going to be, all these other different kinds of things. Democracy is just the idea that the people decide, right? And so, in a sense, we are a democracy. But what a republic is meant to do is say, okay, well, let's get specific about that. What does that mean? And how can we actually utilize this? So just for the sake of specificity and clarity, I would just say that. But the person is right. I just want to.
Okay, well, this is going to be, I think, a different convention and a different paradigm. So not to say that there's anything inaccurate in what you said, but I also think this is going to be a different convention. So within its own convention, this may be simultaneously accurate. So let's watch it and go from there.
Before we discuss political systems, however, it's helpful to address the confusion that has been spread about the political spectrum. Many have been led to believe that the political spectrum places groups such as communists on the far left, fascists or dictators on the far right, and political moderates or centrists in the middle. However, a more accurate political spectrum will show government having zero power on the far right to having 100% power on the far left. At the extreme right, there is no government. The extreme left features total government under such labels as communism, socialism, Nazism, fascism, princes, potentates, dictators, kings, any form of total government. Those who claim that Nazis and fascists are right-wing never define their terms. This amounts to spreading confusion. Toward the middle of the political spectrum can be found the type of government limited to its proper role of protecting the rights of the people. That's where the Constitution of the United States is. Those who advocate such a form of government are really constitutional moderates. So let's analyze the basic forms of government. They are monarchy or dictatorship ruled by one, oligarchy ruled by a few, democracy ruled by a majority, republic ruled by law, and anarchy, which is ruled by no one. In discussing these five, we'll see that they can be narrowed down to even fewer. Looking first at monarchy or dictatorship, this form of government doesn't really exist in the practical sense. It's always a group that puts one of its members up front. A king has his council of nobles or earls, and every dictator has his bureaucrats or commissars, the men behind the scenes. This isn't ruled by one, even though one person may be the visible leader. It's ruled by a group. So let's eliminate monarchy, dictatorship, because it never truly exists. Oligarchy, which is ruled by a group, is the most common form of government in all history.
Okay, well, before we get into oligarchy, regarding that way of doing the spectrum and disregarding monarchy as just a disguise for oligarchy, we might say, for shorthand. Anyway, I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Well, I'm wanting to withhold a little bit because we haven't heard much. But I don't know. So far, I can definitely say, like, I don't think this man studies history very much. This sounds to me like somebody who is thoroughly uninformed about governmental systems, because I really don't understand, I guess, how you could. First off, there's such a separation between dictatorship and monarchy, if one really is being honest, that to link them both as the same, even though they are autocratic, meaning rule by one, which is the actual term he's looking for, autocracy, because monarchy is specifically kings and queens, whereas dictatorship is either a political one-party dictatorship, which is most common, or sometimes it could be a military dictatorship. And those are important distinctions, by the way, because, like, so for example, in a military dictatorships very rarely ever have a leader. They usually take the form of what we call juntas, which is a Spanish word that I believe means council. But the point is, it's usually a group of generals. And that's a lot more similar to what he's saying as far as like an oligarchy, right? Military dictatorships can have a one leader. And I think really common examples of that, for example, in Japan, existed in Japan, like the shogunates. But a lot of times they're in the form of what we today call these juntas. But if you're going to look at political dictatorships vary all over the spectrum. I mean, Joseph Stalin had so much power by himself that even his own confidants and members of his own party were terrified of him and didn't dare question anything he said. On the flip side of that, the Soviet leaders since Stalin had really little to no power at all. It was a communal sort of oligarchical thing there, right? And so that, and you can see this exist in other places too. Sometimes kings have really autocratic power. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they trust their councils, right? Sometimes their power is based in a level of theocracy, or sometimes there's a constitution behind it, or you know what I mean? Like, it's just, I want to see what the paradigm he's trying to set up is, but just his initial disregard for monarchy as a system and his mixing it with what an autarky is.
I didn't want to cut you off, but I do also want to maybe say how I'm hearing it is that definitely the idea here is to cut through other ways of describing it to get to fundamental principles. And so it seems that monarchy is rule of one and oligarchy is rule of a few. And then he'll describe exactly what democracy, or I might not be breaking that up right, but what that's going to be, as opposed to a republic. I think he's going to rule out anarchy first, which will be no rule at all, because he's going to argue how that never maintains over time.
Well, I even get that, but I'm just saying, like, I don't think that I feel like this guy has a point he's trying to make, and he's kind of allowing so far it seems like he's allowing the particulars to be damned for the point of his point. Because even in what you just said, with like he separates here, and I know it shows it obviously, but he separates republic from democracy. That's just not really accurate. You know what I mean? Like a republic is a form of democracy just as much as a dictatorship is a form of an autocracy, excuse me, which is that rule by one. So I don't know. I want to see what the point it is that he's trying to make, because it could be that he's making a good point with some skewered facts, but so far I don't have a lot of faith in what's being presented.
Yeah, I mean, if the facts aren't good, then that rules it out. The question is it the matter of how the facts are being labeled, that is then being considered, an incorrectness. because like a lot of what I heard is like the convention of what these things are called. So yeah, we'll let this roll through all at once and see how its own convention seems to stand. So just now they ruled out all monarchy as there's never actually the one person. I think that implies even if there appears to just be the one. So one could consider that tinfoil hat, I guess, but also the idea of a public figure representing a group and then doing it without honesty is not far-fetched at all, on the other hand. So, yeah, let's see as a whole how this divides things up. Because it seems to me that there is an underlying principle underneath this that we're seeing play out in reality. But it's not the way it's being presented to us as playing out in reality. So, I mean, maybe I'm being taken for a ride, but maybe, you know, what's respectable out there, but still sort of on the conservative side, is actually a ride that was made to stop us from going on this ride. So we'll keep watching it, and we can speculate about it, and not only speculate, but just really give what we think about it in a minute here.
Of its members up front. A king has his council of nobles or earls, and every dictator has his bureaucrats or commissars, the men behind the scenes. This isn't ruled by one, even though one person may be the visible leader. It's ruled by a group. So let's eliminate monarchy, dictatorship, because it never truly exists. Oligarchy, which is ruled by a group, is the most common form of government in all history. And it is the most common form of government today. Most of the nations of the world are ruled by a powerful few, and therefore oligarchy remains. At the other end, we find anarchy, which means without government. Some people have looked over history and found that many of its worst crimes were committed by governments. So they decided that having no government might be a good idea. But this is a mistake, because as the ancient Greeks stated, without law, there can be no freedom. Our founding fathers agreed and held that some amount of government is a necessary force in any civilized, orderly society. In a state of anarchy, however, everyone has to guard life, liberty, and property, and the lives of family members. Everyone must be armed, and movement is severely restricted because one's property has to be protected at all times. Civilized people have always hired someone to do the guarding, a sheriff, a police force, or some branch of government. Once law enforcement was in place, the people were freer. They could leave their property, work in the fields, and so on. In short, the proper amount of government makes everyone freer. There are some who advocate anarchy, however, not because they want no government, but because they don't like what they have. They use anarchy as a tool for revolutionary change. The condition of anarchy is very much like a vacuum where something rushes in to fill it. These calculating anarchists work to break down the existing government with rioting, killing, looting, and terrorism. Tragically, the people living in such chaos often go to those best able to put an end to it and beg them to take over and restore order. And who is best able to put an end to the chaos? The very people who started it. The anarchists who created the problem then create a government run by them, an oligarchy, where they have total power. This is exactly what happened in Russia that led to Lenin taking total power, and in Germany, where Hitler's brown shirts created the chaos that brought him to power. But anarchy isn't a stable form of government. It's a quick transition from something that exists to something desired by the power-hungry. It's a temporary condition, and because it isn't permanent, we eliminate it as well. The word democracy comes from two Greek words, demos, meaning people, and kratein, meaning to rule. Democracy, therefore, means the rule of the people, majority rule. This, of course, sounds good, but suppose the majority decides to take away one's home, or business, or children. Obviously, there has to be a limit. The flaw in democracy is that the majority isn't restrained. If more than half the people can be persuaded to want something in a democracy, they rule. What about republic? Well, that comes from the Latin, res meaning thing, and publica meaning public. It means the public thing, the law. A true republic is one where the government is limited by law, leaving the people alone. America's founders had a clean slate to write on. They could have set up an oligarchy. In fact, there were some who wanted George Washington to be their king. But the founding fathers knew history, and they chose to give us the rule of law in a republic, not the rule of a majority in a democracy. Why? Let's demonstrate the difference in the setting of the Old West. Consider a lynch mob in a democracy. 35 horseback riders chase one lone gunman. They catch him, and they vote 35-1 to hang him. Democracy has triumphed, and there's one less gunman to contend with. Now consider the same scenario in a republic. The 35 horseback riders catch the gunman and vote 35-1 to hang him, but the sheriff arrives, and he says, "You can't kill him. He's got his right to a fair trial." So they take the gunman back to town. A jury of his peers is selected, and they hear the evidence and the defense, and they decide if he shall hang. Does the jury even decide by majority rule? No, it has to be unanimous or he goes free. The rights of the government aren't subject to majority rule, but to the law. This is the essence of a republic. Many Americans would be surprised to learn that the word democracy does not appear in the Declaration of Independence or the U.S. Constitution, nor does it appear in any of the constitutions of the 50 states. The founders did everything they could to keep us from having a democracy. James Madison, rightly known as the father of the Constitution, wrote in essay number 10 of the Federalist Papers, "Democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths." Alexander Hamilton agreed, and he stated, "We are a republican government. Real liberty is never found in despotism or in the extremes of democracy." Samuel Adams, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, stated, "Democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself." The founders had good reason to look upon democracy with contempt because they knew that the democracies in the early Greek city-states produced some of the wildest excesses of government imaginable. In every case, they ended up with mob rule, then anarchy, and finally tyranny under an oligarchy. During that period in Greece, there was a man named Solon who urged creation of a fixed body of law not subject to majority whims. But where the Greeks never adopted Solon's wise counsel, the Romans did. Based on what they knew of Solon's laws, they created the 12 tables of the Roman law and, in effect, built a republic that limited government power and left the people alone. Since government was limited, the people were free to produce, with the understanding that they could keep the fruits of their labor. In time, Rome became wealthy and the envy of the world. In the midst of plenty, however, the Roman people forgot what freedom entailed. They forgot that the essence of freedom is the proper limitation of government. When government power grows, people freedom recedes. Once the Romans dropped their guard, power-seeking politicians began to exceed the powers granted them in the Roman Constitution. Some learned that they could elect politicians who would use government power to take property from some and give it to others. Agriculture subsidies were introduced, followed by housing and welfare programs. Inevitably, taxes rose and controls over the private sector were imposed. Soon, a number of Rome's producers could no longer make ends meet, and they went on the dole. Productivity declined, shortages developed, and mobs began roaming the streets, demanding bread and circuses from the government. Many were induced to trade freedom for security. Eventually, the whole system came crashing down. They went from a republic to a democracy and ended up with an oligarchy under a progression of the Caesars. Thus, democracy itself is not a stable form of government. Instead, it is the gradual transition from limited government to the unlimited rule of an oligarchy. Knowing this, we as Americans are ultimately left with only two choices. We can keep our republic, as Franklin put it, or we will inevitably end up with an oligarchy, a tyranny of the elite. We can keep our...
Okay, so before we open the floodgate of pushback, another way that I want to frame up this that's, I think, perhaps referring to the same spiritual dichotomy is that dichotomy of those who believe that there is, because there is God, there is objective truth and objective right and wrong, as opposed to the other side of the dichotomy where humanity is in some sense the standard and the top and the defining factor, so that we see how that splits between, as far as in the principles which are espoused. We can talk about Republicans being hypocritical or whatever as we get into it, but as far as what's espoused, the Democrats seem to be in favor of the democracy in terms of this convention presented here, as well as in favor of humans being the standard. And then what the Republicans espouse would be what is described here as republic, rule of law, and then ultimately for that to have a real foundation, like in real conservatism, that's founded in Jesus Christ. And so proposing that as a parallel way to talk about this paradigm that they're showing here, go ahead and let it loose.
Well, I guess if I just had to be as honest as I could, I just think this is a video that maybe demonstrates why it is good for us to be studiers and to have, even if we are to reject the academic paradigms as presented, to still have scholarly people. Because there's kind of, there's a lot of just factual error, I think. And I'll try to hammer home at one particular point because it more gets to his point, right? He has this, so he describes republic as the right, res publica, or public thing, meaning the law. That's not actually true. Res publica does mean the public thing, but it refers to the state. It does not refer to the law. And the idea is that the state is a matter of public affair, not that we are all held up to a law. That's not anywhere found in the strict definition of what a republic is. And it certainly wasn't necessarily found in the Roman republics. I find it interesting that he puts up the Roman Republic as this land where everybody was free, or as land that at least had some level of freedom. But ignoring...
Well, what he mentioned clearly would have existed for a very short time, because he mentioned in all kinds of other categories most of the history that most of us are aware of.
Oh no, I'm talking Roman Republic. I'm not talking post Julius when they transitioned. I'm talking even in the Roman Republic.
Yeah, but wouldn't a good amount of that have been? Wouldn't it at some point in that he was saying that it turned into a democracy that turned into an oligarchy? So then it shortens the window some, if that's the case. If I'm following his claim.
Well, I think, if I may, I think the idea that Rome ever wasn't an oligarchy is kind of, it's ignorant, if I may be coy. I don't think coy is the right word there, but just blunt. because first off, the people who were allowed to hold positions of power in the Roman Republic were explicitly aristocrats and nobles, not the common folk. The common folk did not have the ability to, and in fact, when the common folk became able to do these kinds of things, history has looked negatively on it, such as the election of Julius Caesar to be consul. He was considered a populist.
Isn't that the democracy portion that leads up to the
No, I'm
oligarchy
saying from the
portion?
very beginning, from like, this is the way it was always in the Roman Republic. Like from the day one, when they set this up, only the elite were able to vote. Only the elite were able to hold public office. It was very much, we are free, but the peasants are not necessarily free, which of course the overwhelming majority of the population. And you know,
Again, then the
unfortunately,
continuing pushback is it then within that context, because he's talking about stability of government. So then the context of stability of government would not necessarily be hindered by the unethicality. But then I do see how if you consider the reality of everyone involved, then economically, so from an economic vantage point, I see how there's no possibility of viability to the model, but it seems like in context of stability of a state, then maybe contextually. And I'm
well,
just
I'm just
pushing.
talking
I'm
about
just
the
pushing. I'm
idea
just
that,
pushing back for proper testing. I'm not trying to be difficult to you, but you know.
well, no, and I get the point. I'm just kind of saying that, you know, because his primary reasons for declaring this republic as a stable system of government is by saying, number one, that it respects people's freedom and creates a free system, and number two, that it relies on, you know, it sort of centers around the law. And it's just, both of those things just aren't accurate. The public affair is the state, and the idea is that the people have a basically that the state has made a public affair, right? That the people have a say in it, kind of like a democracy. And then the other portion of that is when it comes to freedom, republic may or may not have freedom, right? It sort of depends. The system itself is nothing more than a system in which elected officials represent, in a representative form of government, their constituents. Whereas in a direct, and to give you an exact example, in a pure democracy, they would ask a question, for example, do you want to have, you know, I don't know, invasion of Iraq or something like that, right? And the people would actually vote, and each individual vote would matter, right? But in a republic, the people have already voted. We voted for elected officials, and then those officials are going to vote on that particular question. That's all a republic is. It's a specific form of democracy that may or may not include oligarchies within it, that is meant to make the system more palatable and more useful, right? That's it. Now, there is truth to the fact that we have a law that is above kind of, you know, every person in America, and that is a big portion of what makes us have a stable society. That has nothing to do with the fact that we have a republic, though. It has everything to do with the fact that we have a constitution. In other words, we have a document that either cannot be, or in our case, cannot be without some serious qualification, amended, and it is binding on the whole land. And this is the thing that has always been used to bind societies throughout time. For example, you could claim that the Israelite monarchy was constitutional because the Torah was their document, right? The law that everybody was held to. But notice they were a monarchy. And in fact, they were even a theocratic monarchy, right? So it has absolutely nothing to do with the exact system. It has everything to do with having a written code of law that is higher than any man. And that is entirely ignored in this, though he kind of hints to it in this idea that the law being the center is the key, right? He just,
Yeah, and then what did you say just now is that key thing? Are you saying that from your perspective, the law having the higher authority is the key thing, or am I misunderstanding?
yeah, no, the key that he is pointing out, which is in some instance the key to successful government, though it doesn't necessarily reserve itself to one system. It can be a republic, it can be a monarchy, it can be whatever. It is that system of having a law of the land that is above every man, or a constitution. But again, constitutionalism can be, and you can have constitutional communism. You can have constitutional monarchy. A constitution only means that you have that document that nobody can break and that it binds every person. It doesn't have anything to do, and that's kind of, I think, a big portion of the point is that there's, these small errors at first are small errors, but then when he tries to make his ultimate point, they're a collection of errors, and now it's a big point, right? Like, and just another example of it, he talked about Solon. He says, the Greeks never adopted Solon, and I mean, if you want to say in his own lifetime, yeah, the Greeks never adopted Solon, but the Athenian democracy was absolutely based off of the laws of Solon. There's no debate about it. That's just a matter of historical fact.
Okay, but and then because I gotta be honest, like to me, what I saw here seemed to be a way of dividing spiritual paradigms that cut to important core realities. Now, I'll just throw out what it looks like to me and why it rings true to me in that way, because this idea of having, not trusting the people with government, but rather establishing a state to be trusted with government. So that's where I would how I would describe this divide here between democracy or republic. Then the Democrats want, it's like as if the Democrats want to use the depravity of mankind to like manipulate, and it's not necessarily just the Democrats, but the democratic principle, which could involve, the rhinos and perhaps controlled opposition and perhaps all those people are wanting to bring things into this more elitist direction because they all see themselves as the elitists. And then amongst that, they're jockeying for position as it all goes that way. So they have like these different moving parts of these different paradigms going at the same time. Some of them where they're on the same side together, and some where they're really vying and jockeying for position and competing with each other. And so the thing is that there are certain people who are in advantage. Like people who want to play the game one way would rather have it played in a republic sort of circumstance. And then people who play it another way would rather have it played in a more democracy circumstance. And we seem to actually see that be the dividing line between the two political parties. Not necessarily that the Republicans are on the people's side, but that they want to play the advantage of that side of the game. That's where they're willing to go in and so hopefully I kind of conveyed where I see this paradigm cutting to, spiritual principles that seem to ring true within our circumstances. So I don't know if I'm being naive, but because I have the Bible that I can trust, so I really approach things from a spiritual awareness first rather than technical details when it's these really big things. It's like when I'm on the highway and I'm sort of looking down into the forest because I'm up above the forest, like when I get that whole view of the whole forest, it's not that I understand it by the details of the trees necessarily, depending on what kind of survey I'm doing. So I think I am part of my point is that we can discuss this from another angle, but I don't want to discuss it inaccurately from the other angle because my gears got turning from this video. But I do think that we're going to have to cut through to the spiritual chase, or, to the spiritual core of the matter, if we want to become super effective in our position in Christ, rather than like playing the game the way the game is set up, So I'm not insisting that this is the answer, but I am hoping that the spiritual approach can be put on the table for you, maybe more so than it has been so far.
Well, and the only thing that I would want to just point out with that is just that, we may be wanting to look at like the underlying causes and spiritual factors that, have to do with certain systems of government and certain parties and why our world is the way it is and all that other kind of stuff, right? And I'm not opposed to that. But if we do so on the base, and let me point out, by the way, really quick before I say this, that to be inspired by something that's inaccurate is, I think, in the end, fine. Because
well, that use of the word inspire, because I teach on the etymology of the words spirit and gust and all that, and inspiration and respiration and all that. In that context, it's definitely too strong of a word in my vocabulary for it. That's why the word I used was that I used the phrase, the idiom, that it got my gears turning on it.
Well, you kind of just proved my point in a way, though, right? Because it's not that anybody didn't understand what I just said. It's that you felt that specificity was needed because it's a big deal, right? Well, that's exactly what I'm saying right now. Is like, you may have understood this in some way, but in this particular case, not only is specificity required, but the lack of specificity is so prevalent here that I don't think this actually makes the point. I think this is just, it ends up being effectively, for anybody who kind of knows a little bit about history in this particular regard, this history, like the history of these governmental systems, right? It kind of sounds like, kind of nutty, if I will, right? Because it's just a guy who, like, he clearly doesn't know what he's talking about.
But what if these are the underlying spiritual principles? So are you saying that you're sure they're not? So that's what I mean by like sort of approaching it from that side is because I get how it looks when not discussed from the more core principles side of things. So I'm like, what are the core principles in reality, and what is that in contrast to the convention and paradigm we just saw presented?
Well, I mean, that's a difficult question, honestly. Like, there's a lot of different understandings as to what exactly constitutes a political spectrum. And honestly, I think.
Well, sorry to interrupt you right when you're starting, but I think before you totally get going, it might be a good place for me to mention that, like, my intuition was that what this video was expressing is accurate at that core level. So that was my intuition, and I don't want to like necessarily be presumptuous about my insight into the sort of matter, but I also don't want to like doubt myself where I shouldn't exactly. So I do want you to speak freely on it. I just wanted to put it on the table like that too. That to my intuition, it rang true, I guess, is a summary of what I want to say.
Well, and my point here, the first thing with the spectrums, right, is just to point out that I don't think there is an objective idea as to what exactly defines all the spectrums, because politics is by its very nature subjective. It's quite literally a bunch of ideas of a bunch of people, and how we rule ourselves based on those ideas, right? There's no, like, in other words, governments aren't like in, nature, right? Animals.
Yeah, but there is,
instinctively.
at the same time, there's a sense in which we can boil it down to Christian or not Christian for everything in some sense. And
That's
so,
not even what I'm saying, though. All I'm saying is, like, when it comes to us, because what this guy is trying to set up is specifically a political spectrum, right? Like, he's trying to say, hey, these are the different systems of government, and this is how we can lay them out on a spectrum. And, we can effectively eliminate X, Y, and Z because they go into A, B, and C and all that other kind of stuff, right? And what I'm saying, first off, no political spectrum, if it's a strictly political spectrum such as he presented, is objective. They can't be by default. That doesn't mean that there's no objectivity in politics. Obviously, I believe that the reason that human beings are political animals is because of the fact that we're not actually animals, right? But we're made in the image of God, and he is a political being in a sense, right? In the sense that he is the king, the leader, and we are
and
right?
can you and I maybe agree on what politics is, and that it's how people in numbers like relate, sort of. Or
Yeah.
if you want to define it in some other terms, then that might work too. But I think at this point, a definition would be useful.
Yeah, and I would just say I think I don't have what the exact definition is off the top of my head, but I believe that it would boil down to the way human beings interact communally with each other as it pertains specifically to law and government. And you could perhaps add economy there as well, law, government, and economy. But
yeah, okay, and then but ultimately, any level of people thinking things, and then they talk to each other, and other people think different things because someone thought it, and that happens in numbers, and that comes back into the political system too. So it can be useful to include the cultural level of people relating to each other, as far as not talking about politics on one level, but if we talk about everything, that politics is more on a core level, if that makes sense, or on a more fundamental level.
Well, and so let me just finish this point though, real quick, because I just want to first off point out that when we're talking political philosophy, we do have to recognize that spectrums are men's ideas by definition. There's nothing objective about them, right? But also,
I don't want to jump too much on the spectrum thing at the moment, as far as just defining politics, but I can give an example of where the cultural life is clearly politics, like in Israel. The man of each estate, that was a family and government position, like coming together. So that kind of examples how politics runs through everything, depending on how we use the word, in that everything in this context.
Right. No, I understand that, but I'm talking specifically about this because I'm trying to explain why this video is wrong, right? And what I'm saying is, first off, it presents a spectrum that it pretends is objective, and it's not. But then secondly, what it attempts to define political bullet points on this spectrum, and it does so not only arbitrarily but falsely. And first, let me point out why it's arbitrary. There's really no reason that he chose the systems of government that he did and left out the systems of government that he did not. So, for example, there's no reference to a theocracy anywhere here. There's no reference to a chiefdom anywhere here. There's no reference to any differentiation between, the capitalist versus communist economic system. Or like, there's just he decided that these 5 were the isms that he wanted to go with, or the archies, I guess would be a better way. And he doesn't really give any explanation as to why those are what he decides to choose and not some other kind of system. That may or may not be different. And that in and of itself, I find incredibly problematic, especially when you consider the fact that there is probably between 20 and 30 different isms in politics. And they all have very unique qualifiers and things like that. But then further, right, he falsely defines them. For example, he calls autarky monarchy, even though monarchy is specifically the rule by a king. And then he claims autarky doesn't exist, even though there's very obvious instances of it clearly existing. Nazi Germany, Stalinist Russia, Leopold's Congo. I mean, there are various instances where one man ruled with an iron fist, and even his own advisors didn't dare refute him. He doesn't give any qualifier as to what dictatorship is, when dictatorship can take the form of uniparty state like communist China, but it can also take the form of military juntas like the nations of Panama, but it can also take the form of megalomaniacal religious cults like the imperialists in Japan, and all this other kind of stuff. And then separating democracy and republic falsely, when because he's making this point that like, oh well, you have dictatorship and monarchy in the same thing, which the word he's looking for there is autarky. So he's trying to be general. Well, if he's trying to be general, then republic is a form of democracy. It's just not direct democracy, just like parliamentarian democracy and all that stuff. And I mean, even small details too, like for example, anarchy is not a political system. Anarchism is a political system, right? And obviously that's pedantic, but the point just kind of being that like this is the definitions are wrong, the words are wrong, where things are placed in the spectrum are wrong. The idea that this is all objective is, I think, very misguided. And I just think the issue is far more complicated than that if you want to politicize it, to be honest with you. If it wasn't, we wouldn't have been discussing it for the last 6,000 years.
Yeah, but it doesn't seem like this is meant to politicize it. It's meant to come down to more of the core spiritual factors, cutting through all the complication. Well, I want to push back on one detail. I mean, I know it might seem pedantic by principle, but I don't know. It is the topic, right? So you say that these were autocracies, but it's like, are you saying that there wasn't any core group of a few guys around Hitler that was necessary for Hitler to be able to be in that position? So it was one person instead of something like 5 people? Because is 5 people one person? You know what I mean?
Well, I think that's honestly just a misapplication of terms. Because if you want to say like, okay, am I really the boss or do I have a shift lead, right? Sorry, my dogs are kind of spazzy right now. And the fact of the matter is that's just not a fair paradigm, right? If I have a shift lead who's one of my underlings, that doesn't negate that I am the sole solitary boss, right? So I think that presents a little bit of a false paradigm. But if you want to just get like into the historical specifics and not just into the paradigm, Hitler ruled with a iron fist, especially towards the end. In fact, Heinrich Himmler even wanted to dispose of Hitler because they were terrified of him, right? Like nobody wanted this man ruling anymore because he was clearly out of his mind. His ideas were clearly based in his own megalomaniacal racial principles that even though they shared, they weren't really wanting to die for in a lot of instances, right? And Hitler strong-armed the entire country into, especially when you're talking about 1943 forward, the last 2 years of war, like with an iron fist, unbelievably so, like cult of personality, you know what I mean? And it's frightening for certain to think that one man can have that much power, especially considering how evil of a man he was. But it's frequent, you know what I mean? Napoleon Bonaparte is another example of a man who just ruled France by whim, right? And it was whatever Napoleon wanted. Alexander the Great and the Caesars and the Pharaohs, and there's so many different examples you can give, right, of people who really did. They just rule. In fact, there's a really famous court case in England from 1649, and it's really famous because it was the first time in European history that anybody had actually tried a monarch in a court of law, which is somewhat of an oxymoronic thing to do because you can't try a monarch for a crime against himself in a system of absolute monarchy because he's the very source of the law, right? Now, you'll notice I say absolute monarchy because monarchies are not necessarily a system where the king is the source of the law, but an absolute monarchy absolutely is, not to use a pun. But so the point is they tried him in 1649, right? And it was a big deal because, how do you try a king for treason against himself, right? And in the court case, one of the things that they used against Charles who, by the way, is the son of King James, who translated our King James Bible, or who authorized the translation of our King James Bible, I should specify. One of the evidences used against him was that he believed in absolute monarchy and the divine right to rule, and he ruled as such. He ruled as a monarch, single ruler, right? And that was considered to be damning evidence against him in the court. Now, not to comment on the court itself, because I think there was corruption going on there, and it's a huge and interesting historical conversation. The point is that they would have no case against him if it wasn't for the fact that he was one who ruled as a monad, right?
Wait, but if they're able to take a case against him, then he did not rule as a monad.
Well, it was stolen from him. It was a coup d'état in a civil war, right? So that's a piece of.
Oh, okay.
So, and I should have pointed that out. Yeah, he was being tried in a military tribunal. Sorry, that's an important detail, because obviously, right, he can't be arrested if he was ruling as a monad. So thank you for pointing that out. But yeah, he was arrested by the military in a coup d'état. And then actually, this is, if you are familiar with English history at all, this then started a brief, about 11-year period where there actually was no king. And in fact, England was ruled by a Lord Protector whose name was Oliver Cromwell. And the idea was it was supposed to be a republic, but it effectively just ended up being a system where Oliver Cromwell was a dictator. And that's not the point, though. The point is just, that's just a way to, give people, the other things that were going on around this in case they might be familiar or want to look it up. But like the point that I'm trying to make is just that, the reason for this coup, the reason for people wanting to go out against him, and the whole case they provided against him was, hey, he's an absolute monarch, and we don't believe that's a justified thing. There is even historical context that goes into that, because England, since the days of the Magna Carta, didn't believe in absolute monarchism, whereas the rest of the world typically did. But you really do have to, because if you want to boil it down, and I don't think you should, I think it's too complicated to boil it down. But if you do want to boil it down, there is autarky, which is rule by one. There then is forms of, I would call it aristocracy, because it could be anything from a binarchy to a rule by an elite of 1,000 plus. But the point is, you're an aristocrat. You can call it an oligarchy as well, oligarchy as well, if you like. But I think there's a lot of language that is, kind of gives you a loaded use of the word that aristocracy doesn't. But either way, they're interchangeable. I don't care. You would then have a system of monarchy, or excuse me, not a monarchy, democracy, which would, of course, be rulership by the people in some way. And republic would be a subcategory of that. And then I think you would have to include theocracy, of course, because the theocracy is specifically, it is a rulership by an oligarchy in a sense, but it obviously has differences as well. Like, for example, I can join the Catholic Church, which means in theory I can be the Pope. Even though if we were in an aristocratic system, right, there's no chance that I am going to be a member of the aristocracy, right, because you're born into that. So like there is even distinct differences there, because it's a church, right? And so you have the system of theocracies. I think you have to take into account military systems of government, which, like I said, typically take the form of juntas. And I'm sure there's even some things I'm missing, to be honest with you. Anarchism, of course, would have to be added there as well. But nonetheless, I mean, if you absolutely had to boil it down, I think at least those 6 categories need to be taken into account.
Okay, what about the distinction between wanting to let the sway of the people take it wherever the sway of the people takes it, or else having relying on a safeguard, which is almost a form of theocracy in a sense of like something beyond the people governing is instead the higher principle. In some sense, it puts that into the same category as theocracy if you substitute the God for something else in the same role. So in that sense, those can be the same category from our human perspective in a way. And then a theocracy is probably going to be a fake theocracy because they're not capable of doing a real theocracy. So then it actually is not a theocracy. It actually is that they set some kind of rule over themselves, like a constitution kind of a thing, perhaps. But you're on mute, brother.
Well, and yeah, and I would personally say that, in my opinion, which is certainly not exhaustive by any stretch, I think that the best guards that create a system of responsible government, first off, within the category of democracy, which I think is a good category to have, there is the subcategory of republic, which I think is good. And I also think that, you have the subcategory within that even of a constitutional republic, which I think is doubly good. And in fact, politically, I would define myself not just as a conservative or even just a traditionalist, which is commonly more known as a Burkean, but I would even say constitutionalist more specifically, because with the context is clearly American constitutionalism, and I think that definitely is the best system we have currently as far as what actually can dictate how to run a system of government.
And when I think of all corruption, and I think of how much the system still holds together, and how they haven't been able to just totally do what they want, and despite the valiant effort they've put in, to take us over. Yeah, the system does impress me for sure.
Yeah, and I think too, it is, it's important to note, and this is the Lord's providence, right? But we had a great luxury in the United States of not having a founder, right? Or not having a lawgiver. Now, obviously, with the exception of Israel, because Israel's lawgiver was getting his law from the source, right? So that's obviously different. But when you look at what happened in the United States, rather than being this single system where a single idea won out, what you actually had was a collection of geniuses, right? You had the brilliant polymath who was Benjamin Franklin, who was really kind of, he's an atheist and he's a lot more of a humanist. And he's got all these kinds of philosophies that are very much based in the Enlightenment and stuff like that. And then you have Thomas Jefferson, who is a little bit more of a radical democratic, really kind of almost bordering between democratic and anarchistic kind of guy, who really believes in the primacy of the individual and that individuals are free. And then you have somebody like John Adams, who's a Burkean conservative, right? Who is he's kind of part of the aristocracy, and he's very much a believer that the rule of law wins out always, right? And so on and so forth. And you have this, I think there's something like 100 people who ultimately played a part in the forming of our government, though there's only like 13 framers and I think 28 signatories of the Declaration of Independence. You really have, excuse me, you really have unique time in history where so many brilliant people from so many different fields were able to get together and kind of hammer out what is it that will make a strong system of government. And that's why there's so many unique peculiarities, right? We're not just constitutional. We're not just a republic, but we're also federalist. We're also capitalist. We're also a system that is based on a libertarian ideal. We're also a system that very much takes for granted not only rights, but that rights are granted by an omnipotent creator.
Is the libertarian ideal compatible with the conservative ideal, or is that a necessary definition to say because it's one, it's not the other? But I don't want to jump into that question just yet, because I think there is definitely a sense in which I am a theonomist. And I think even the United States requires that there is enough godly people. And I think ultimately people in numbers have power. So, democracy might hinge at 50% in its most pure form. And maybe, some people need to get up to 90% or whatever before they really have power in their circumstance. But regardless, it seems like if you get sort of a cultural singularity that goes in the wrong direction, that takes essentially the whole culture over time, then there's nothing that can save that. And so we might have to circle back around to this point, as it might be graduating into taking the discussion in a whole new direction, and we're not ready to leave the spot we're on yet. But I think that might make it that regardless of different perspectives or mystery in trying to assess exactly what's going on, the gospel is really the answer that if we do it well and we do it right, and it's the gospel unto an edified church, not just the gospel unto the church has to be edified and take responsibility as well as grow in number, but that the gospel is what, if we do well with it and if it is accepted well to many people, that will not fail. And then without that, I don't think that there's any hope that's a sufficient or worthwhile hope. And then, so when we get into like fundamental principles, I think my fundamental principle is rather theonomic, even though I appreciate the system that's in place to account for the sin of sinners, which is part of its theonomic foundation that we have in our American system that we may not call theonomy, but I'm saying that as far as it needs to be founded in the one true God, Jesus Christ, then in some sense, it needs theonomy in order to be what it is with value. So you're on mute, brother. So,
Hear me?
oh, cool. Yeah, we hear you.
All right. Sorry about that. Yeah, and so no, I definitely think there's a lot of that needs to go into underlying principles. I do think that principles definitely work better than systems, because systems, I think, are supposed to just be ways to work out principles. Right. So if you start with the principle or with the system and say the system is a good system and therefore we're going to have a good government, I think that's a flaw. I think rather you should have good principles, and then you should build a system around your good principles.
Yeah, and do you understand what was intended in the video? That he was using those labels, but then making them a matter of principle, as he defined. And I don't want to totally open the whole thing again, but just address that aspect.
I mean, I do get it. I just think that it needs to be hammered out with a lot more particularity, and I'll just kind of end with that. But I do see his general point, because really,
yeah, and when I ask if you get it, that's not the same thing as asking if you agree, but it's just a matter of
exactly.
trying to get the communication working well. So good.
Well, and even I will just say, to an extent, I do agree, because his ultimate point is that rule of law is kind of like a foundational principle, as opposed to rule by a few or rule by majority. And I don't disagree with that. I just think the way he presented it wasn't good. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I hear you there. And well, that's good, because I think we did a good job of getting where we should go and getting there in a good way and stuff through but easily could have been a lot more contentious, but instead we communicated very well about it. So I appreciate that you did that and we did that. So then I don't know how much more we should discuss underlying principles today, or like I think we should make it a goal to understand these things in a boiled down way, and then we understand that like from there you could start talking about things in all sorts of chemistry in the sense that it's actually very complex. But when we talk about principles instead of systems, are what we should have at the foundation. I think it's when we talk about principles that we can that we can distill it down to something that's simpler, and then we understand that those principles apply into the complex. And you are in mute, just in case you don't know.
Thank you. Real quickly, just because I feel like being a stickler at the moment.
A stickler is good. Like when it's like I want this to be like we really make progress, and so we want that progress to be correct if we make it.
Oh well, just so you know, real on this point, I'm only gonna take like 5 seconds, but I was
humor. I sense humor coming.
yeah. And it's humor directed towards the chat too. I just wanted to say to Gavin, because Gavin's being ridiculous. Yes, the Earth is flat and the moon is a hologram, and there's reptilian overlords living in there. Did you not know? And if that sounds ridiculous, then please quit trolling people in the live chat. Anyways,
as long as people aren't getting into foulness and stuff, and let's respect people's requests. If someone does request to be left alone, then not harassing and stuff. But otherwise, I'm not gonna like police how people decide to interact. That'll be fine. So, so on the topics, I guess I was talking about principles as opposed to systems, and maybe you and I should make it a future goal to boil down to principles better and like handle these things in those terms. Hopefully in what's like the most accurate way, and not like being beholden to how it's been framed up by others. Not to disregard everything that's been framed up by others, but I think I don't know. What do you think about the principles approach?
well, no, yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think that, like I said, I think that we should have a idealistic look on politics, meaning that I think we should have our ideals, our principles first, and then we should try to set up the systems around that. And that's why I think that, while I prefer the Republican system of government and the constitutional system of government over all other forms of government, I also recognize that other systems of government have worked not only in their time, but in their area. Because like if I were to make the claim, for example, that monarchies are just inherently bad, it just wouldn't work, right? I mean, some of the greatest leaders of all time were monarchies. Some of the were monarchs rather. Some of the periods of greatest human development were under monarchs. Some of the periods of greatest adherence to the faith and of people getting, having their religious liberties respected and things like that were under monarchs. And of course, some of the reverse of that is true, right? So principles are always, I think, the underlying factor, and not necessarily systems. Systems, I think, are interchangeable. And that I think is something that we can definitely agree on, if that's something that you would also agree with. And I'd also say real briefly, I think I don't have an exhaustive list of principles, of course, just because I'm not a super genius, right? But I do think some of the principles that absolutely should be respected are the rule of law, the right to life, the right to private property, individual autonomy, right? Things of this nature. And, I think that those are all really important things. And I think that all of those can be derived very easily from a political look through Scripture, by which I mean, if I were to take the principles applied in Scripture and then apply them to my political life, would I come to these same conclusions? I think yes. Like, for example, religious liberty. Well, if God didn't decide to put a sword to somebody's head and say that they should, convert to Christianity, then who exactly am I to do that, right? And I'm not saying that's the only logic, but that certainly is a pretty legitimate form of logic, right? Like, if he's not going to do it, then obviously you doing it would be a blasphemy.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I want to back up to principle some, and I know like if someone doesn't know you at all, then you haven't really like presented yourself fairly. But I also kind of want to skip the part where we cover that base and just assume everyone knows you. And then what I'm thinking is backing up to principle. Like I'll just say it. To me, the underlying principle is that we trust the victory of Jesus Christ. And so then the question for us becomes, what is the role of the body and its multiple roles in regards to politics, so we can decide our role each? Because I think of like, one important role may be to offer what should be offered, even though there's no hope that they'll vote for that. So that it's like, it wasn't that we compromised and never offered it, and then they didn't choose our compromise, but it's like we offered the right thing, but we couldn't make them choose it, But then at the same time, people who decide to take pragmatic results into account, that may be part of the role of the body of Christ in this, but if the underlying principle is that we, the trust in Jesus, having the victory is the underlying principle, then does that draw that into question? So yeah, I guess I'm cutting right to it now, huh? The core.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that I think makes it difficult is, I think it's absolutely right that the primary principle is, I wouldn't even, don't get me wrong, trust is a part of this, but I would just say the first commandment, right? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, body, and soul. Really, that should be our first principle in everything, right? Not just politics, but everything. And I won't get into everything else, but just the point is everything. And the difficulty, I think, with applying that politically is that you can't apply that systemically, right? Each individual.
Well, you were mentioning how it informs your principles, right? As far as
Right.
like religious liberty for others. So I'm saying, like, without getting into all those weeds, kind of like, if I say one of the roles of the church is to offer the correct thing, even though they won't accept it, I'm talking about the correct thing, including religious liberty, not a pretend ideal where everyone's Christian or something.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would completely agree with that. I completely agree with that 100%. Because it is that whole idea of, we present it, but we obviously, just as you said, we present it not as a system, but as principles, right? Because it's each individual who needs to be convinced, or really convicted. I don't know if convinced is even the right word, but
well, so then let's say like, the Democrats carry all the elections because the Christians actually offer the right things and like come together like the real Christians who aren't like spiritually really compromised with the world, but they more spiritually agree with Jesus. So they do come together and like get their votes together, and then the Democrats are just like in charge, but it's actually a significant amount of like the Christians actually attempting to do it the right way. But then the results are even worse, at least in the short term or whatever. So then like in the face of these sorts of hypotheticals, how do we get real about the pragmatics versus the ideal? Which is why for me, the word trust is sort of like our avenue to doing these things right. But I do appreciate how you boiled it down to God's greatest commandment. So Yeah, so if you can speak on that.
Yeah, definitely. So I would say that there are, first off, I do think that if we are truly seeking God, that the pragmatism will follow through eventually. And I do emphasize eventually, because it may be so eventually that it's not even in our lifetimes or even our kids' lifetimes or their kids' lifetimes, right? We don't know. But, you know, and you know, it's funny because here in America, we deal with prosperity preachers a lot, right? I think if you're unfamiliar with prosperity preachers, you may have the impression that they're biblically illiterate, but that's actually not true. They're actually quite biblically astute. And it's part of the reason that, you know, they're deceivers, is because they use passages that have a ring and a modicum of truth to them, and then, you know, clearly know the scriptures while they're doing it, and then lead these people down a terrible sort of path, right? Well, and one of those things that you find often is the book of Haggai, both chapters. And the message of the book of Haggai does kind of have this, you know, the reason they tend to utilize it a lot is because there's this message in the book of Haggai of, number one, why do you work on yourselves before you work on, so why do you work on your own house before you work on the Lord's house, right? And number two, how can God accept you when you work on the Lord's house if you are unclean? And so, in other words, the point just kind of being, before you work on yourself, work on your relationship, or excuse me, that's not the right way to put it. Before you work on your carnal life, work on your life with the Lord, work on the Lord's work. And before you work on the Lord's work on your relationship with God, right? It's sort of Haggai presenting the proper biblical model of how these things kind of work out, right? And to an extent, he is saying there is, you know, God does bless people when they follow this pattern, right? And of course, where the prosperity gospel abuses that is they say that it's like a formula rather than something that God may or may not do on his own sovereign will. But the point I think that we can take from it, just as believers, is that God does, you know, have this idea, or not this idea, this promise, right? Of, hey, if you are,
Yeah, well, but I think you're getting at is that we don't want to shortcome on faith in like God being blessing towards our rightful worship according to New Testament teachings of what's rightful worship, you know? Like
exactly.
we don't want to reject that he does bless those good things. But then we know that he blesses them in what is the ultimate blessing. So like people have been blessed to be martyrs, you know? So that's sort of what kind of blows the whole prosperity gospel thing away, is like your category of prosperity has to include like maybe prosperity for you is going to be literal poverty, you know?
100%. And also another thing it has to be as well is you have to always have this idea of, and I think James provides this perfectly when he's talking about asking for something in prayer, right? You have to have this idea of,
Well, it
I
has
can
to be
claim,
rightful motive.
right? No, and let me just kind of, you know, lay out the point real quick. I think the mentality is I can almost claim God's promises for, you know, for things, even things like prosperity, but also I don't go to God expecting things even as far as prosperity. In other words, I can have faith in his promises and trust in his promises as if they will happen, while also fully understanding that if that promise is not one that was for me, that I can have faith in that and know that all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purposes. And of course, also with the very important understanding that the likelihood is I'm actually in that latter category, because
And it's the altogether according to his purposes for those who trust him, is where I redefined prosperity to be like, well, in that sense, it can be true, but your prosperity could be this or that or the other ironic thing, you know?
exactly, right. And and I think the real key here, and it's, you actually just basically said it, but I want to just explicitize it more, if that's a word.
It is now.
Right. You know, the scripture is absolutely a prosperity scripture, but your prosperity may not be on this earth, right? It may be that you have to suffer on this earth for the sake of the gospel, and then your prosperity will be with God, fellowshipping with him for eternity, which is the true prosperity. And if he blesses you with physical prosperity, then so be it. But if he does not, then of course so be it. Because the true prosperity that he has promised all of us in the end is eternal life and fellowship with him. And that's, I think, where the big portion where the gospel, the prosperity gospel, falls apart there, and where exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, and we're gonna bring this back to our topic and stuff in just a moment. I'm gonna interrupt it with a little bit. The stream is called Shrewd As Serpents is the main title I put on it. So with that in mind, we have Rage. I've done some exchanges with him, interfaith exchanges, I'll call them. That might irk him. But I'm just poking fun. But actually, this is true. And I'm not saying there's no exceptions, but it is, this is the rule of thumb for sure, that if politicians tell you they are religious, it is calculated. Politicians get on the national level because they compromise everything. And I think that some of this being shrewd as serpent stuff that when CJ and I maybe move forward in the discussion, we'll want to specifically talk about how those things factor in. And you can engage with this too, CJ, if you want. And
hang on just one moment. I need to take care of something really quick.
Okay. So I don't know if these are becoming kind of out of context because I'm just skipping to Rage's own comments. But maybe if I mischaracterize something too much, there'll be another comment for me to put up where he corrects me on it. But I don't say that as someone that is atheist, but someone that has dealt with a lot of politicians, mostly on the left. Yeah, and definitely Republicans need that religion card more, but then on occasion they may actually be genuine. Or maybe they think they're genuine when,
and then,
on my spiritual level, I might disagree depending on the circumstance. So there's a lot of circumstances possible.
Well, and to be fair, though, that even goes like both ways. Like one of the things I've always pointed out when talking to people in a purely secular manner when it comes to politics is like, so for example, people will say, oh, I support the legalization of marijuana, right? And then you'll get a whole bunch of people who are like, yeah, man, I agree with the legalization of marijuana, dude. And this is just one example. It can be any issue, right? But this is just the issue like that I typically use. And in reality, the politician may or may not care about this issue and your rights and, your friend who got arrested for having a doobie on, his person in a car or something like that, or whatever it happens to be. That's not the point. They don't, whether or not they actually care about that isn't the point. The point is that they really would like your vote, and they understand that you're the kind of person who's going to vote based off of that one issue.
Well, and let's compare this to people heaping up teachers for themselves as listed in scripture, where it's like, by being in the seat in the pews, then that's sort of a vote for that pastor as opposed to another pastor. And I know it's not a one-to-one correlation, but definitely helps make sense of it and see what's going on. And it's a pretty straightforward thing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's it's just one of those things where people will rely not only on their celebrity, but also on issues that they know play to your emotions, your hobbies, your likes, and
then sometimes that's the Bible in the case of church and stuff, which it goes back to the point Rage was making. So it's like people appear Christian or claim Christianity, but sometimes in a different spirit, they're doing what appears very much the same.
Yeah, definitely. I 100%. And I'll give a little olive branch to Rage in this, right? In that, you can clearly see that in the Donald Trump presidency, right? Even the fact that his spiritual advisor was Paula Kane White is just a perfect example of that. Because it's that like you want to talk about false Christian, you know what I mean? You want to talk about prosperity gospel, you know? I mean, her last name is literally Cain. If you want to like talk about like being discerning, you know what I'm saying? Like, I'm not saying that necessarily means anything. I'm just kind of telling a joke there. But the point is,
that does seem to be how things work out. But yeah, and we follow. It kind of goes without saying. I do want to keep moving through this part of the discussion. I know. So, who do we trust? How do we remedy or handle the situation in response to the part about politicians being dishonest? Somewhat in that context, I guess. In Rage doesn't know the answer. The easy answer is revolution, but not against each other, against them. Since that will never happen, we need the common folk seeking political solution. And I think there's a lot of common ground there. So maybe on fundamental principles, though, we'll be competing against each other in these local elections. But hopefully, when things come back to the local level, some of the craziness will come back in to stuff more reasonable. Yeah. So, depending on what becomes obvious enough, then on a regional level, the United States might be a place where this could be done. It seems like over the past 2 years, so many different things have become obvious in so many different ways, and even the two countering perspectives, another season like this, and maybe in some sense there will. But I also concerned, the Bible talks about the beast coming up out of the sea, which is nations and tribes and languages and families. And so what I concern about there is that, maybe the people will come together, but it'll be an ungodly thing, and that is going to be how the beast comes up. And maybe the oligarchs know that that's what's going to happen, and they're going to be playing into it too. I don't know if there even is a distinction between those two things. It's all the oligarchs and the people against Jesus, perhaps. So like right now, it looks like the people against the oligarchs, but then because on a deeper spiritual level, it's actually, Jesus against people who want to own themselves instead of for God to own them. Then we may find that things pan out according to that deeper reality in the long run. But I appreciate that we had some good discussion, even though I sort of ruined it with trumping it with my biblical perspective. So far he says I got it right. Well, I just mean from Rage's perspective, I was like, all this political stuff, common ground. Then I'm like, but, you guys are like the non-Christians versus the Christians. So I was like, forget it. Did it all, sort of, oversimplifying and being funny about it.
Well, and it is funny because we talk about common ground and all this kind of stuff. I do genuinely believe there was a time. I think 2012 was kind of the time that it happened, when there were enough people left, right, and center.
Yeah. So this comes back around to my final point. Sorry to interrupt. Real quick. Go ahead.
Yeah. I was just back in 2012. I think there was a little bit of a movement where enough people left, right, and center were seemingly on the same side to an extent. And I think that they kind of got behind to put a face on it, Ron Paul. And Jesse Ventura was someone that people really liked back then too. And you had guys like Occupy and Joe Rogan and Bill Maher who were very liberal, but then also guys like Ted Cruz and your Alex Joneses and your Constitution Party and everybody else like that who are of course very conservative or independent or libertarian. And it did seem like there was a possibility of that happening at that point in time. I think he kind of ruined that partially by running for the Republican nomination rather than as like a third party or independent or something like that. But since that moment, I think there's been so much polarization that it's hard for me to imagine that any, first off, that we could possibly agree enough to rally behind a single candidate, but let alone something like a movement. And I know you might say, like, well, shouldn't those be in reverse? But actually, it tends to be the case that a single candidate can bring together multiple movements.
Yeah, that makes sense. So then, if I can give us whiplash, then does all of this become a moot point because of if we're talking about the loving God with all our soul and might as the underlying principle, and then if that with all our heart, soul, mind, and might, and then if that was not the underlying principle, even in this Ron Paul case, then is it sort of like we're saying what we should be doing is like standing by our principle and even competing against those sorts of things, in the sense of let's offer it just totally right, or how does that fit together?
Well, I think that just kind of is up to the sovereignty of God in one sense, because it was the case before that people of a Christian persuasion and with Christian ideals and with a firm biblical foundation managed to convince the non-believer to go along with them. And I think we had prosperity as a result. But, how do we know that's going to happen? I guess we don't, right? It's sort of just a matter of what God has decreed.
Because Ron Paul is not in Christian foundations, right?
Well, no, he is. He's a Baptist as far as his specific denomination, but he is a man of faith, is the point. And he says he uses the title libertarian for himself, but you do have to understand Ron Paul's libertarianism is not like Adam Kokesh's libertarianism. It would be much more akin to what they call right libertarian or the Tea Party. In fact, he's widely considered like the intellectual godfather of the Tea Party from like a historical perspective. And
so it's
now,
more
that
like
said,
it's more like libertarian principles applied to a constitutional Republican framework.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say that because there was a point I was going to make, there is the caveat of he does believe religion should be separated from his political life, which makes him different than, say, like, for example, a Ted Cruz, who makes religion central to his political life. And what people prefer there, I guess, is maybe a matter of discussion. But yeah, for the most part, it is libertarian principles and then applied to the system of government we have.
Yeah, and I also wonder when it comes to how religion is engaged into government, if some of that's semantics,
Yeah.
It's like if things are founded in the one true trueness, which is Jesus Christ, and then you're conducting it in a way that's not specifically to favor those who agree religiously, but yet still on those principles that are in Jesus Christ, then I think to some extent, there's overlap that they would still use the opposite wording for, And then there's still some difference, probably.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, okay, so then, so those are like the kinds of questions that will have to be asked, like, with the concern of the different Marxist things we saw going on, it was much more tempting to compromise with someone like Trump rather than let this president election go down for long-term principles. And like you were saying, it could take multiple generations. So then when you say it could take multiple generations, then we're talking about walking by faith instead of sight.
Well, absolutely. And let me give a quick brief just for the audience sake. I want to give an example of that, of where God blessed his people with physical prosperity, but it took not just generations, but centuries to manifest. And it took centuries of martyrs to manifest. And that is in the early church. The early church had to go through persecution after persecution after persecution after persecution, but they held
Well,
the faith.
let's bolster this, just go a little more rapid fire with this, and also like the slavery in Egypt before the Exodus.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great example, actually, is because that's another example of people who were faithful. And sometimes some people were faithful being born into slavery and then dying in slavery, right? And not because they died because of, being only 30, 40 years old or something like that, but just that's how long that they were actually there, right?
And then the whiplash again, because we go back to what you were saying with the church, and if we think about how long it took under Romanism, and I know it wasn't like an absolute thing, like we can tend to think of it in absolutes, but still there was like so much oppression from Rome for centuries until finally the Reformation really persevered.
Right. And since then, right, God has blessed us really with the greatest prosperity anybody's ever seen. I mean, Protestant nations have been blessed with prosperity that the entire rest of the world is just unprivy to, and always has been throughout history.
Have extra accountability, and that we may be looking at some pretty fierce judgment.
Oh, 100%. 100%. In fact, it's funny. When I was doing the debate against Skylar Fiction a really long time ago on the judgment on the Canaanites, he actually asked, if God, did X, Y, and Z to the Canaanites, why isn't he going to do it to us? And I told him, I was like,
You're like, he is.
Yeah, I was like, dude, you have no idea. I wake up every morning and think to myself, Lord, thank you that you have not judged as you clearly could be justified to do the nation that I live in, and giving us another day, because we definitely deserve it. And I know it's coming. I'm convinced it'll come in my lifetime, personally.
So brother, what's most encouraging is that I was just asking the questions, and you kept giving the answers that are taking places where I'd hoped they would go. So I just keep asking more questions. But yeah, I think it is important that we that from here on out we walk by faith instead of by sight, and that gives a lot of hope for immediate results, potentially, because there's so much that's possible through faith and through the moving of the Spirit. So if we put the hands of politics in that, then we really have some kind of real hope, even when it looks hopeless. But then also the walking by faith in the long run. So that's a long time of being like, look, we tried the compromising thing and it didn't work. The right option always has to be out there. And maybe it'll come time when the ducks line up in a row and the right option is viable enough that you then press the point to switch where the voters are or something. But the first step is definitely to really offer the right option, and then make it the principled Christian option for, like, look, if you're not going to vote for Republican, you obviously can't vote for the Democrat platform. And so you have a principled option. It's better than no vote, and we can do this one in faith and see where it goes. And then if people make their pragmatic decisions in the Lord, then they do so. But so I guess are we on the same page with all that?
I think so. I think the one difference, and it's not actually a difference. It's more of a difference of, I think I personally would take the path of idealism, meaning that I am comfortable voting for a man who may get 12 to 13 votes, to exaggerate, if I believe in my conscience that he is the right man to vote for.
Well, starting out, that might not be an exaggeration.
That's true. That is
But
actually very true.
yeah, so I think that's where we really do especially agree. Is it's like let's do our best to formulate a Christian option that gets things right in a Christian way. And the way things have been such an obvious split between people who will succumb to worldly pressure or people who are in the worldly spirit. You know, I'm not saying those two sorts of people are the same, but they're both on the other side of a threshold from those of us who are going to truly seek to follow after God and have at least a basic level of discernment as to the difference between God and the world, you know? And so I think with this being the moment when that is obvious, you know, we got to look for like the right candidate and try to convince them to vote on mere principle just for like the reasons we're talking about and that kind of thing, you know? Not necessarily saying that we get to be the one to impact this or whatever, but it's just like, in a sense, it's if not us, then who? So we at least want to know what we're aiming for and like be in the game and do our part, whatever that ends up being, you know?
Yeah, and you know, I'm kind of living through at least a small example of that. We'll of course see what happens. But here in my own state, there is a man by the name of Ammon Bundy who I very much like, and he has been said by everybody, including members of the Republican Party, whose platform he wants to seek, that he's just unelectable. Nobody will vote for him. You can't win. You can't win. You can't win. Right. And I've kind of been standing here on the principle of, look, this is like, I think this is the guy. And I think this is the time for the guy. And I don't mean the guy as in he's the savior, but I mean the guy as in he's the one who so far has put forward his sword at this time. Right. And if he can't win, so be it. But I'm not going for not the guy. Right. And he's actually getting a good deal of popularity. So we'll see if he ends up being a decent pick. And, you know, of course, you know, we'll pray for the Lord's guidance in that. But the general point just being, if he was going to be as everyone thought, which was a nobody, right? The point is that I'm not voting for not the guy, right? This guy has put forward his armor and sword and said, I will, you know, fight for the cause. And, you know, I'm not going to go for this guy who, you know, puts forward his feet and a burger and says, I'd like to sit on my duff and watch TV, but I support the cause. You know what I mean?
So then for us, like, with that principle, you know, it means that as you and I mature into our roles in all things, you know, on this earth, you know, in this ever that we're in now before the ever to come. So yeah, it means that we move forward with these principles, building on them and aiming and looking to get people to be ambitious in faith and keep putting our everything that way, you know? So it's like with Bundy, you're on the same principle here that's motivating you, but ultimately like forming it ourselves on strict Christian principles may or may not look different. I mean, we would have to have a sit down with Bundy as far as the specificity of this, you know? But I see where it's the same principle, and then it's like taking it further into its Christian-based, God-based, you know, the first commandment, second commandment-based conclusion, or yeah, logical conclusion.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, when we go through all this kind of stuff that we have here, right, when it comes to really any of these things, but politics in particular, because it's the one we're talking about now, right? We do always have to remember that, and not that you haven't, right? I'm just saying that I just want to pinpoint this for the audience. We are inhabitants of God's world. We are characters in God's story, and we're utilizing God's systems, meaning things like politics and philosophy and all that kind of stuff, right? The things that he's laid out for us. So we have every reason to have faith that every single aspect of it, without question and exception, works for not only his glory, but for our benefit as those who pursue his glory.
And all things are ours. So they're not the unbelievers, they're ours.
Well, that is right. I mean, if we have ultimate reconciliation of all things to God, and we in the end inherit what is the Lord's, right? He is in our inheritance. Then that is ultimate reconciliation of not things to us. I don't want to say it that way because that would not be accurate, but certainly of things being, utilized in a way that is to our benefit.
Yeah, and we've been given all authority. And so yeah, we did really good here was we used that video that got my gears turning as a way of digging down to the fundamentals from a political perspective, when ultimately we wanted to get down to the gospel fundamental behind it. But I think it was good to go through it that way and not take the shortcut and then get there. And it's sort of like we really established a frame to go into the future, like further having better aim, so that when we are productive, our productivity is better aimed towards what our goal should really be. So like CJ, when you're like doing political shows of different kinds, like over the next years, if this is the same aim that you keep oriented to, then being well aware of that and letting it really influence your decision making is going to be good. So that was the reason I wanted to bring this together, was to really try to get things going in the direction of like, because there was a time when I didn't want to, I wanted to compromise with the whole Trump thing because I didn't want to face the consequences of, a regime that wants to bring in Marxism, And I don't know exactly how that's going to pan out. In some senses, it's panned out pretty badly so far, but as far as like, it does seem like they're not going to be able to just ride momentum all the way to opening camps, that they're not going to be able to do that with this rush. So that's good. Because I was, with the way 2020 looked, I was concerned how far the rush could keep going, and that I didn't know what 2021 would look like. But maybe we've seen to some extent where brakes are starting to go on the train. But with that said, at the same time, as I was compromising with Trump, you said in regards to like Daily Wire and that sort of thing at one point that you don't want us to like kind of like friendly fire against people who are on the same side, so we don't want to like think we're on different sides when we're not. So I don't know if that's become more nuanced or some change of perspective on that, or because that is some of what I want to iron out, is like, if we are on this fundamental gospel principle, then in what ways do we want to say we're on the same side as who, and in what ways do we want to say, but because we're doing this, that doesn't let them really be on our side in this, So drawing those lines at the correct points so that we then make use of having correctly drawn the lines. So this is the thing, I just like really frame it up like very explicitly and then like put the coin in the machine and see what comes out. We'll just keep doing that.
Yeah, and it's like it's an interesting question, right? Because there's on one end there is a clear principle that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, meaning the start, right? But then there's also kind of this, there is a principle of Romans 1, where there is kind of this general idea of God does, obviously not in the sense of special revelation, but
Yeah,
in
and
a manner of speaking, reveals things to non-believers, like, for example, like a scientific, and maybe even revelation isn't even the right word.
well, it's
But
referred to as general revelation as opposed to special revelation, just to categorize the two. That's the theological terminology.
for sure. And I'll just use that then, general and special revelation. So, and I'll even give some examples of that, like in my own life. So politically, one of my political forefathers, if you will, is the Rabbi Meir Kahane, who was murdered in 1990. So he's well before my life. And he's kind of a radical in a lot of ways. There's a lot of bones to spit out when it comes to his politics, but there are a lot of underlying principles that he presented that have shaped my political thought today, and I think in very good ways, and allowed me to recognize some fundamental truths that maybe other people would not allow me to recognize. At the same time, I do have to recognize, of course, that he is a rabbi. He accepts the Talmud. He accepts the Rambam, right? The Mishnah. He obviously rejects the Messiah, which is a very big deal, of course, right? It's no small thing. And so these are all things I need to take into account. And there are certainly elements where that becomes obvious. For example,
Yeah, and then okay, go ahead.
I was just going to say, for example, Meir Kahane is, or was, I should say, a little bit too prone to violence. And while sometimes he certainly utilized a justified form of violence, he was certainly willing to border on terrorism. Whereas I think somebody with a proper Christian foundation would not do such a thing. And of course, he didn't have a Christian foundation, period, right? His foundation is modern day Judaism. And so, when looking at his political life and the influence that he's had on me, and how Kahanism is a fundamental part of my political upbringing, right? All these different things and their logical conclusions and how they manifested in his life need to be taken into consideration. But then now there's that all is great in hindsight. But now there's the question of, like, well, what if Meir Kahane was alive today, right? Do I support him? It is where the rubber really meets the road. And to be honest, I don't know that I have a clear answer to that, because there are ways in which I think it would be useful, right? I think he would be good for the state of Israel. I think that he has, a lot to do, a lot to say about, for example, the persecution of Karaites and Messianic Jews in Israel would absolutely not happen under Kahanism, because the Jews are the sovereign people in Israel, according to God, according to his interpretation of God, at least. As a result, you don't, civil wars and persecutions of Jews, you just don't do. It doesn't matter if they accept Jesus as Messiah or if they only accept the Tanakh. Right. So, but at the same time, obviously, he wants to make Toraic law or halakhic law in Israel. That's obviously, influenced by the rabbis. And there's all these things that just need to be considered. And I don't know that I have a clear answer to that, is basically the overall point.
Well, then, it is a contextual question in the sense that I said, like, drawing different lines, different places for different purposes, right? And so, like, one purpose that I would want us to focus on is, like, our role from the local level to the federal level, and considering, the global deep state that probably already fancies itself the owner of our federation, our republic, and definitely wants to have as much control of it as possible. But then, like, we don't want to be involved in a global federation. What we want is to not have the globalism. So we have to act from the local level to the federal level. And then in our Christian way and based on what we've decided that we want to, you know, walk by faith on principle and trust in the long run, even if it means suffering in the meantime. So for our own personal republic, then it's like, if the Karaites here were in danger, and that's a different thing because obviously we want to be talking about that distinction, but like we're talking about certain belief systems that could be called hate speech, and then that could be criminalized, and that could become pretty intense, sort of parallel to that persecution of Karaites in Israel. So in that sense, it's like when it comes time to us to either compromise for that temporary safety that one time, or like to continue to walk by faith and not by sight, then like I suppose ultimately if it's really extreme, it's decided circumstantially, but at the same time, if we leave it up to being decided circumstantially, then they can always make it something, you know? I mean, it was Trump this time around as opposed to like the Marxist pressure from, you know, the terrorism or riots, whichever vocabulary you want to use about it. So like, you know, then like, what's it going to be next time that I'm going to really want the Republican instead of the Democrat, but then I have to decide to suffer it and split the vote. And not that we're necessarily, you know, it's hypothetical in order to get to the point of like, we have to know what stands we're willing to take at what cost and why, and like plan things for the right reasons, not just responding under pressure, you know?
Well, I'm excuse me. I can take that back now to, I brought up Hey Guy earlier, right? And excuse me again. Now the instances where you're going to find the best, quote unquote best, because of course it's false, so there's no good evidence for it, right? But the instances where you find the quote unquote best evidence for people who talk about prosperity are usually Haggai and Deuteronomy 28, which is ironic because Deuteronomy 28 also includes all the curses. But anyways, the the interesting thing about both these passages, which you could call God's prosperity passages, if you will, right? Haggai has only 2 chapters, so that's why I'm just referring to it as quote passages. Is, you know, if you look at these things, what ends up being sort of the fundamental message of them, right? In the end, it's that not just that if you, you know, if you live for God, then all these things
Faithfulness,
are added to.
but that's why their word of faith in so often is word of faith so often overlaps with prosperity because it's faithfulness is the point, right?
Yeah, actually, and it's exactly, and it's part of the reason it's such an abuse too, by the way, because I think a lot of people who are in prosperity gospel churches are deceived
Well, it's a
baby
way to
believers.
make the true believers more reluctant to walk in faith, also because it makes it like this complicated thing where like, well, what does walking in faith really look like? This or that or what, you know? And that's why I'm like, it's better if we don't come to it with questions and we're just like learning from God and we start from that place of trust and grow from there, you know? And that's where we want to be rooted. We don't want to be rooted in a place that like has questions. We want to be rooted in listening to the teacher.
Well, and I just want to point out real quick though, with both of these quote prosperity passages, right? Moses and Haggai, what do we end up having actually happen in Israelite history, right? First with Moses, he gives the mitzvot, and you know, he gives the whole halakha, and he gives them the Torah in total, and he moves on, he dies, right? And you know, Yahshua goes on and he does it himself. And obviously then you get the period of the Shoftim, right? The period of the judges. And for a long time, it's not what Moses talked about in Deuteronomy 28, but the faithful keep going and they keep going and they keep going. And eventually it is the kingdom of David, right? Eventually we do have actually the period of prosperity, not even starting with David. It actually started with with Saul, with Shaul, right? And we go forward and move forward all the way down to Solomon or Shlomo.
But wait,
And
does it start with Saul, or like, I'm sorry to interrupt your momentum here, but God laments that the people want a king instead of for God to just be their king.
well, and that's true, because they were doing well, not just under actually Shemuel, but also under Eli, right? And they were actually doing very well before Shemuel ever came onto the scene.
Yeah, and then because he's telling Shemuel, like, I've heard one person say, like, God was comforting Shemuel by telling him that it was not, that they weren't like against, it wasn't Shemuel that they were rejecting, but rather God. But that would not comfort Shemuel at all, because Shemuel would be better comforted if God could have said, "It's not me they're rejecting; they're just rejecting you, Shemuel." And then he would have been like, "Thank God, I'm relieved,"
Yeah,
So
exactly.
so I
But
found that kind of hilarious. Like, people who come to the Bible with the selfish perspective, and they're like, as if Samuel would have been comforted by them rejecting God instead of just rejecting Samuel. It's like, what man of God has that kind of selfish perspective, like ego-based perspective, when it comes to like all the people in God?
Well,
Kind of hilarious.
absolutely. But the point I'm just trying to really kind of hammer home here, right, is like you had 300 years before Moses's prophecy in Deuteronomy 28 came to pass, and the faithful came back. And if I'm using the Hebrew here, I should actually be continuous with it, right? Moshe is his name, and those who had faith in the words of Moshe that had come from Yehovah, right? They did not live to see that, and we may not live to see it, nor us or our kids or our grandkids, right? Although they might, and we of course hope and pray that they will. But eventually, it did come to pass, right? And the same thing with Haggai. When Haggai, he goes out and he starts, preaching. He's talking about, hey, if you build the house of God before you build your own house, and if you work on yourself before you build the house of God, God is going to bless you. And then God didn't for about 100 or some odd years, but eventually he did. And eventually Israel had the Second Temple period, which was their greatest period of intellect and architecture and poetry and philosophy and even fiction, right? Which fiction was kind of a rarity in the ancient world. They had the Maccabee, right, which was a period of even independent rule for a minute. God granted them independent rule for a minute. All these other things, but the people who Haggai talks to in his day would never live to see that, right? And of course, in the end, if there is no live to see that, right, we do have ultimate prosperity that has been promised to us in heaven, right? So it may be that there is no generation that gets to see a return. That could be the case, but the point, of course, is ultimately the gospel. So we will at some point have our ultimate prosperity, which is fellowship with Yehovah eternally. But if there is physical prosperity to come back to this earth, it doesn't, it's not something that we could lose faith in just because God hasn't actually given it to us in our time, right? You keep the faith, you continue to suffer generation after generation, just like the believers did before, and eventually God will keep his promises. And when he does, they are amazing. They're absolutely amazing, right? I mean, Israel could have never imagined everything that happened under David and Shlomo and everything else besides that. I mean, even think of the split of the kingdoms, right? The split of the kingdoms when they went into Samaria and into Yehuda, right? They absolutely did have a period where they were like somehow able to be free from Egypt, from Assyria, from Babylon, from the Hittites, from all of these other people, right? In a way that other kingdoms just weren't. And what is that other than the sovereignty of Yehovah, right? And it's this firm conviction of belief in him, right?
Well, not only that, but the Jews still exist today.
Amen. And it boils down to, I think, not only the greatest commandment, right? But and what is that greatest commandment, right? What is the greatest commandment? It is Shema Yisrael, Yehovah Eloheinu, Yehovah Echad, right? What does that mean? That means that God is one God ultimately, that he is the ultimate being. He is the ultimate Elohim, Eloheinu,
right? And we are to serve him as our Adonai, as our Lord, as our Belim, our husband. And that is just period and end of the conversation. And he will deliver to his bride, which is the church. And it doesn't matter if it's going to be in this life. It'll happen at some point. It may happen in paradise. It may happen at a point that we never actually get to see, but it will happen because God is faithful and he is true to his word. Amen. Salah. I mean, there's just nothing else that you can say about it.
Amen. So I very much appreciate that. I don't want to totally blow the steam on that, but I do want to bring it a bit down to earth as far as like a launching point for next time. And what I'm thinking is that like for men like me and you, I think we're in a place that we should be pushing for the totally principled, uncompromised Christian option. And, we should be looking into that and doing our best to have that, to be providing that, whether we can only do it on one level or another level, or we can only attempt and not actually get candidates out there, or, whatever it is, exactly. The point being that, it can also be something that the Republicans have to compete with, so that then they actually have to do some of the things that they don't do. So it could be that even before it totally succeeds, that it, if it does have some level of influence, it could still have some level of influence in the meantime, Like if Christian voters are like, look, if a Republican candidate is good enough on certain points, then I'll pragmatically vote for them, but otherwise I'll by principle vote for this Christian candidate, so that if we can at least, so it's not necessarily waiting for the ultimate being the chosen option, but it can also put pressure on the Republicans to improve things, but where we don't have to compromise to make that happen, where we do it uncompromised, and then the way it amounts to pressure instead is the natural flow from that, So, yeah, so I think it's definitely more all about like what you were just preaching about faith, and I'm glad that we're on the same page with that. So then it's a matter of moving forward to have pragmatic aim with it. And then as we go into our future, we'll see what that turns into with like pragmatic doings beyond aim, So I don't know. How do you think, is this like a productive talk, or are you leaving the discussion the same as you already were, but now you got me on board? Or, I mean, what's it? Because I think now we're on the same page, and I was hoping to get on this page, and that's what it looks like from my perspective. I was hoping to get on this page together with you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think this has been a good conversation, definitely.
That's the thing, is in a sense we're both busy men, and so when we make the time to have a conversation like this, it's like we dealt with whatever we needed to for 20 minutes beforehand or whatever. Now it's been 2 hours and 15 minutes. But I want those to be like really powerful sessions when they happen, so that it's like there's real progress in existence. It's not just that like we talk and then eventually we talk again. You know what I mean? So I like that this was really like establish some things, and really with aim on, actionable results. Yeah, because this already improves our results just in the things that we already do, but it also sets us up to like further plan these things and put ducks in a row, that sort of stuff. So I'm really excited. That was a wonderful talk. And yeah, I liked that basically what I wanted to bring to the table could mostly be brought to the table just by asking questions from a biblical perspective. And then that just allowed you to carry it and for us to be on the same page. So that was really deal. I really liked that. And I like that everything came down to trust, and Messiah is the King of Kings. So let us thank God for that, and let us live in that reality. And yeah, in context of everything we established in this talk. So I'll say, this is a very fitting time to say it, to just trust Messiah. He is the anointed one, the savior of humanity, and he has ascended to the throne of all, the capital A, all that is all. So, amen.